The purpose of Wealth Talk is to educate, inform, and hopefully entertain you on the subject of building your wealth. WealthBuilders recommends you should always take independent financial, tax, or legal advice before making any decisions around your finances.
Welcome to episode 133 of Wealth Talk. My name is Christian Rodwell, the Membership Director for WealthBuilders, and I'm joined today by our founder, Mr. Kevin Whelan. Hello, Kevin.
Hi, Chris. Good to be with you again today.
Yeah, and I think this might be our final episode of 2021.
Wow, and 2022 rolling on very quickly, isn't it? And it's a perfect time to be reflecting on things, isn't it? And also, I suppose we all get in a comfort zone somewhere in our life, don't we? And life wants to keep bringing us back to that. But, we want to keep raising challenges for people and hope that, as people get thinking ready, enjoy the festivities, whatever that means to you, and get ready for 2022. We want to come out with a bang, particularly start talking about our Wealth Builders for families and bringing children into the equation and teaching parents to be better teachers, which means to be a better teacher, you need to be better educated in the world of how to build, how to protect your wealth, and then how to pass that on with all the skills. So that's to come. But this episode is a long one, so we'll keep the intros short, Chris, because probably, when you get a question that you get all the time, when somebody says, if I had £1 every time somebody asked me that question, I'd be rich. Well, this is the question I get asked, not quite every day, but several times a week. And I got not quite fed up with answering the question, because when you get asked the question, which is, Kevin, what's the difference between SIPP and SSAS? Awkward language, self-invested personal pension, SSAS, small self-administered scheme. They're not sexy titles, no marketing prizes, no Brit Awards for that. What you get is just boring pensions. But pensions are the mainstay and so tax efficient. Forgive the terrible titles. Think about compounding exponentially, tax-free. And there's a huge difference between the SIPP, which is probably 50 times bigger in terms of numbers in the UK, than the SSAS. And I want to put right a myth that there are some myths purported, often by those who sell SIPPs, that they're better. And I just want to put that case, that there are 10 key differences. And I've enlisted the help of co-director Paul Brooks, who runs the SSAS program, for he and I to have a really, really good dialogue. I think it's about 45, 50 minutes, Chris, if I remember it. Mm-hmm. I get on my soapbox. I don't care how long it takes. If the message is worth giving, it's worth spending time on. So bear with us, guys. It's a longer one, but if it's something that's important to you, you've thought about it, you've heard somebody say the word SIPP and somebody say the word SSAS, and you think they're the same. They're not the same. They're completely different. There are some parallels, like, what's the difference between a hatchback and a Formula One? They're the same, aren't they? They got four wheels and they go, but they're not the same. One of them is infinitely more powerful than the other. And you need a bit of tuition on how to drive it, which is really what a SSAS is. But anyway, rather than steal the thunder of the work Paul and I put in, maybe that's probably a good one to end the year, because it's such a powerful subject. And maybe for those people who are curious to find out a bit more, they could reach out to us, Chris, and then, we can help some people discover the differences for themselves. And, we can deal with SIPP or SSAS. And for some people, SIPP is right. For some people, SSAS is right, but not in the same proportions as 50-1. It's probably 2-1. More people should be doing SSASs than they are. And I want to get this message out. And I make no apology for it.
Yeah, no, it's a good one. And why don't we pull out one final Trustpilot review just before we head on to that conversation with you and Paul? And it's from one of our members, James Clack. Actually, he's referring to SSAS, so quite appropriate to have today. So James says, having set up a SaaS and a limited company in 2019 for managing serviced accommodation and holiday lets, I drifted around investment opportunities with the SaaS before joining WealthBuilders in January 2021. And the focus and clarity plus the support from the WealthBuilders community have provided invaluable in using a loan back to help grow the business and to attract investors. It's an exciting 3 to 5 year journey that we are on, and I look forward to working with WealthBuilders in the years ahead.
There you go. Invaluable. I mean, that's a word I like to hear. Invaluable. And, and again, that consistency of clarity and support, connection, and a feeling of confidence that people get when they feel they're in a trusted environment. They're not learning things that could cause them to fall down a big crevasse of a lack of knowledge. We just surround ourselves, don't we, Chris, with brilliant who's, because at the end of a how question, how do I do this? How do I do that? There's always a brilliant who knows the answer. And fortunately, we're in that position where we built up an incredible list of very solid, very powerful, very trustworthy who's, and we're willing to share those inside our community. So well done to James. Thanks for choosing us. And hopefully, your journey will be an exciting one.
Yeah. So thanks again, everyone, for tuning in and listening, and for all of your kind words again this year. Kevin, thank you for your support with the podcast and everything else this year.
We could ask for one thing, at Christmas time, there's normally a time of giving a gift. So give a gift of telling somebody else about the podcast, right? We put a lot of time and energy and our commitment to be consistent every single week. We put our whole selves on the line here. We obsess about this. So if you enjoy it, just do one of two things. A small gift. It's all I ask of you. Not more than 1 minute of your time, given the number of hours we put in. Could you do this? Could you tell somebody else, hey, I've got this podcast I really like. It gives me some clarity. It gives me some challenges to think about. And we all know how important it is to become financially independent in a very troubled and uncertain world. Or number two, could you tell us what you like? Like James did there, a little review that just says, really enjoying the podcast, guys, keep it up. Anything like that, just so we know we're not talking to just like a blank canvas and an audience that we don't know is really enjoying it. So I know you're probably thinking, well, somebody else is doing it and somebody else will leave the review. I'm asking you, take a moment, 1 minute, tell somebody else or tell me, and I'll be very grateful for that. With that, Chris, we're not going to do a debrief of the podcast. It's too long, but I would like to sign off, wish you a very Merry Christmas, and to all our listeners, have a fantastic Christmas and an absolutely brilliantly wealthy 2022.
Okay, here we go. SIPP versus SAS pensions, 10 key differences.
Hello, good evening, and welcome to this educational piece between myself, Kevin Whelan, founder of WealthBuilders, and the SAS director of WealthBuilders, Mr. Paul Brooks. Good evening, Paul.
Good evening, Kevin.
Listen, Paul, we get asked loads of questions, don't we, on our wealth building journey. Mm-hmm. And we're going to talk tonight really about one of the questions we get asked more than anything else. And as you're the director of SAS for WealthBuilders, we're obviously going to touch on that. Mm-hmm. But I suppose more than any other question, Paul, there's one question we probably get asked more than any other, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And it's this really common question of the main differences between a SIPP and a SAS.
Well, it's a big, big set of questions, and there's not just one. I mean, I think you've outlined here there are 10 key differences and probably more, but sure. We don't want to get people too bogged down in the minutiae of details of lots of things we could talk about. Mm-hmm. But I suppose, the key differences, obviously there's a language difference. SIPP, self-invested personal pension, and SAS, small self-administered scheme. They both kind of hint, don't they, at self. There's a common word, and that, therefore, if it's about self, then it means me. So therefore, I must be in control, right? So a SIPP and a SAS got to be the same.
Well, you'd think, but of course, there are some pretty big differences, and we'll touch on all of the key differences tonight, and hopefully really give people a good, solid understanding of the main differences and why they're a different vehicle.
Okay.
And of course, we can then also perhaps touch on, as you mentioned, I think a little while ago, just thinking about, who's eligible for what, and we can have a little bit at the end where we talk about eligibility.
Yeah,
I think would be helpful.
Cool. So, Paul, let's go straight for the jugular. What's the first?
Number one, investment choice.
Got to be the same, right? So, self-investment does what it says on the tin. Got to be able to choose my own investments in a SIPP. Got to be able to choose my investments in a SSAS. Paul, come on, it's got to be the same.
Well, sadly, no, not quite the same. A SSAS really has the widest choice of investment that's possible. And that's for a few reasons, but fundamentally it's because you, the SSAS owner, are put in the driving seat. And when you're in the driving seat, you're completely in control of how and where you invest your money. Within the rules, of course, but it allows you the complete freedom to invest wherever you choose.
Right.
Now,
that sounds good.
It is. It's fantastic. It's a real entrepreneurial pension vehicle. Allows you to do a huge range of different things, and is a hugely powerful tool for business owners, for sure.
Right.
SIPP is different for a couple of reasons, and again, it comes down to control, but it's because with a SIPP, the pension owner is never in control. The control is actually with the company that runs the pension, the professional trustee company. And that means that they set the list of things that can or can't be done, not based on what the law allows necessarily, but based on what they feel comfortable with.
Okay, I think I'm getting that. So a bit like if the menu of what I can do with the SSAS is just whatever the law allows pensions to do, and the SIPP is whatever the SIPP trustee, the professional company who operate that, allow.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely.
So where's there a difference in investment then? What's the difference?
Well, so with a SIPP, there are, I suppose, two main categories that most SIPPs allow.
Right.
One is stock market-based investments.
Right.
So collective funds and shares and, a huge variation of different stock market-based things.
Right.
And some SIPPs will also allow you to go out and buy commercial property.
Right.
Which can be good if you're a business owner and you want to buy your own premises potentially, or if you're looking to buy commercial premises and rent to a third-party business, somebody else's business.
Right. So what don't they allow then? If they allow those, give me a couple of examples of what a SSAS owner might want to do, but can't do in a SIPP. A couple of will do.
Well, the single biggest thing that a SIPP can't do that a SSAS can do is something that we refer to as borrowing, but pension rules call a SSAS loan back, which in really simple terms is the ability for a business owner to actually borrow some of the money from their SSAS as a commercial loan.
We're going to cover that point in access, I think, a little bit later on.
Yeah,
so we'll get into it more. But what about the investment choice that I could make? Is there some things that a SIPP will let me buy that a SSAS, or rather somewhere SSAS will let me buy, but a SIPP wouldn't let me buy? So can I buy a property and turn it into residential in a SIPP?
No, that's not really allowable now, because most SIPP trustees aren't really comfortable with letting people do that.
Right. Okay. Can I lend to a third party with a SIPP?
Occasionally, very occasionally, yes, it is possible, but it's much more tricky, and there are a whole list of ticks in a box that have to be fulfilled, which mean actually in the real world it's quite difficult to do with the SIPP.
Okay. So in summary then, because we've got a lot to get through, anything a SIPP can do, a SSAS can do.
Yes, absolutely.
but anything a SAS can do probably can't be done in a SIPP unless it's buying stocks and maybe a piece of commercial. In simple terms.
In simple terms, yes.
Right. Okay. So given that many people like property, why don't we talk about the different things then, other than commercial property, which both can do? What are the other things that clients in SSASs want to do and realize that only a SAS will let them do that? Give me some examples of that.
Well, a great example is commercial developments in SAS.
Right.
And I guess you could say there are broadly two types. So the first would be commercial to residential developments, and the second would be commercial to commercial developments, taking one kind of commercial property and turning it into another type of commercial property.
Right. So is it the development angle which gives the greater potential to make money, but the SIPP doesn't allow that?
Yes, yeah, that's right. Again, SIPP trustees are always, have almost prejudged that they feel that is too risky. There are too many areas that, could lead to an issue. And rather than allow the person who owns a SAS to use their skill and their experience and their connections to navigate through those, they would rather just say, we're going to do a job of protecting you, and we're just simply not going to allow you to do it.
Okay. That's interesting, isn't it? So then if the purpose of a pension vehicle is to help towards our wealth, but we learn more and develop our skills to be able to get a better return on our investment, the SAS will let us demonstrate our own skill and expertise, but a SIPP will limit us to what somebody else believes is safe.
Yeah, that's right.
Wow. And that's kind of quite spectacularly different, isn't it?
It is. It's hugely different. It's really the difference between being in the driving seat of a vehicle and in the passenger seat, actually.
Yeah, I think I know what I'd like. Yeah, anyway.
Sure.
But moving on from what I'd like, because I'm a control freak, I want to be in control. But okay, well, what's the next one then, Paul? There's got to be another area where there's something else to compare.
So shall we touch on stock market and funds quickly?
Well, stock market and funds, obviously, we're going through troubled times right now, but in a well-diversified portfolio, having some stock market or buying directly equities, buying shares in companies you like, pretty useful to have. And I'm assuming SIPP and SAS both can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you could argue, the stock market and funds is the bread and butter of the pension world.
What's the difference between the two here then?
Well, I guess the big difference is choice. Again, with a SAS, you can create a sort of a broking platform, almost like a home for those funds to sit inside with any company you wish. And there are lots of different platform providers, which gives you an enormous amount of choice to be able to control your costs. And it also gives you an enormous amount of choice about the different types of funds you might want to take. And in particular, low-cost fund options. Sometimes known as tracker funds or index-linked funds. And another type of, it's kind of like a fund, it's called an ETF, an exchange-traded fund, which is a very, very low-cost bundle of shares wrapped up in a neat package that you can buy and get access to for a very low ongoing cost. So
I think what you're saying, and I think you meant index tracker rather than index linked.
I did indeed. You're right. Yes.
That's okay. I'll speak your language, Paul. We're on the right page.
Thank you. Yeah.
But the issue seems to me then, as a SIPP, I've got to buy kind of conventional funds, almost like a retail customer. And as a SAS, as a business owner, I've got more choice about how I access funds. So I could potentially buy those funds at a much lower price and therefore almost like buy wholesale.
Sure. Yeah. There's a huge amount of additional choice, specifically if you're using a sort of a sophisticated broking platform, which might only be available, in a SaaS wrapper or in a SaaS vehicle, because you can't necessarily take a SIPP platform from that provider.
Right. Okay. So I've got more choice. I can drive my costs down. And can I invest in stocks and shares where I can hedge my bets? I can put in stop losses. I can put in risk mitigation techniques. Is that something I can do with both, or just one?
It's generally really something that needs, a more sophisticated platform, and those more sophisticated platforms are only really can work within a SaaS.
Okay. So hence then, conventional funds, conventional commercial property is the domain pretty much of SIPP. If you want more than that, SaaS is going to let you do that.
Sure.
But this all sounds like, maybe I'm taking more risk, Paul, so why would I want to have a pension that gives me more risk, or is the risk the same?
The risk is really the same, because if you think about a SIPP and a SSAS, they're just vehicles. And with one exception, the risk that you take when you get into a vehicle comes down to the driver of the vehicle. And so if you've got a skilled, well-educated, well-trained driver of a SSAS, it's absolutely no more risk. In fact, you'd argue at least the same, if not less risk, than someone who takes a SIPP.
Yeah, okay. That's a good analogy. I like that. So, it reminds me of what Warren Buffett said, Paul, which is risk is when you don't know what you are doing. So the risk is you.
Sure.
So when people say a SaaS is more risky, it's not true. It's just, are you more risky?
Exactly right. Exactly right. And like with most things, there are lots of ways you can mitigate risk, and one of those ways is education, of course.
Yes, and I definitely know that a number of SaaS clients are putting in risk mitigation, learning how to risk mitigate, and learning things like options and how to trade and those sorts of things. Okay. What about other investments that you could choose, Paul? So be moving on to maybe number 4, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
So, so let's see if I fancy something. I quite fancy peer-to-peer. I want to put some money in a crowdfunding platform.
Sure, perfectly doable within a SaaS, because again, remember, you're the driver of the vehicle, you're in control of the strategy, and assuming the vehicle is set up in the right way, you've got the complete scope to do whatever you want, choose whatever platform you want, and of course there are lots of reputable platforms to choose from. In a SIPP, again, much more challenging, because the regulation of SIPP professional trustees means that they're all super nervous about allowing people to do things where they feel there is a level of risk that can't be controlled, and so they prejudge the outcome and they prejudge that it's too risky.
Yeah, I'm getting the sense then that because a SIPP trustee is, they've got capital adequacy issues, haven't they? So every time you go off-piste another investment, which is called, there's a special name for it, isn't there? When you choose an investment which is not kind of on the regulated list. I can't remember.
Non-mainstream investment.
Non-mainstream investment. Okay. So if I want to go off-piste, which is not mainstream, then SaaS will help me. So peer-to-peer. What about if I want to buy shares in my company? I want to help my company grow. Can I buy shares in my own company?
You certainly can.
Can I buy shares in my company in a SIPP?
Used to be possible. Again, much more difficult now.
Okay.
It's possible, but it's much more tricky and likely to be much more costly to do as well. Because
I guess we need to come back to cost, because a lot of people have a prejudgment of cost, don't they? Anyway,
they do.
Often they'll say SaaS is more expensive than in many cases it isn't. Can you think of an investment that some of the SaaS clients we know have bought into that you definitely cannot do in a SIPP, just to bring that more to life?
Let me think. Well, I guess it tends to be the more sophisticated commercial property investments that are more sophisticated strategies where you'll struggle to do that in a SIPP. Remembering that there are only really 4 main investment strategies that can be used. Borrowing your own money, we've already touched on. We're going to spend a bit more time thinking about it in a minute. That's exclusive to SSAS. Bridging lending to third parties. We touched on that and said much more difficult in a SIPP, almost nearly impossible nowadays, whereas in a SSAS, perfectly doable and achievable. You've got purchasing commercial property to own as a landlord, and then you've got and the development, which of course again I've just touched on, and then finally you've got the stock market, funds and equities and all those financial instruments.
So one of the ways that many clients will seek to improve themselves, to develop their knowledge, to develop their skill, so they can improve their ultimate return on investment, is to lend and learn, for example. So they become a bank and they use their money in that bridging capacity you mentioned. Is there any fundamental difference in that? Is that doable in one and not in another? In general terms.
In general terms, again, whether it's a lend and learn where you're being able to leverage the power of, getting a great return and some education, or it's just a straightforward return on your investment with with an interest rate. The general principle is lending is much more tough in a SIPP for all those, predetermined reasons that the SIPP trustee has, what can and can't be done. So I think across the board, whether you're lending and learning or whether you're just straightforward lending with a great return, the challenge is always going to be much, much bigger with a SIPP. And it's easier when you're the bank and you're in control of the lending scenario to be able to get extra ROIs on your money. Lending and learning is therefore much more achievable in a SSAS because you're in charge of the negotiation with the borrower, and it means you can have a dialogue and a discussion and agree the returns. A SIPP trustee really just, by and large, ticks in boxes, and they're not really interested in the more sophisticated side of investment anymore.
Well, Paul, I like restaurants a lot. Obviously, I'm suffering right now. So basically, a SIPP is like maybe a 2-course menu, like a pre-theatre menu, and a SSAS is like an a la carte.
Or a tasting menu, maybe.
I like one of those, Paul. Let's move on to the next one. What have we got next?
So next up, we've got collaboration and joint ventures.
Well, that's a mouthful. So
it is.
Let's talk about collaboration in terms of who you can work with as you create the vehicle, and talk in general terms. What are the differences in the self-invested personal pension? Sounds like it's for one, but a SSAS has got a bit more scope. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So you're right. A SIPP is really a singular vehicle for one person,
right?
Whereas a SSAS is a much more friendly, accommodating vehicle for multiple people, multiple trustees coming together. And actually,
give me an example of.
So a great and obvious example would be spouses coming together to pool their pensions, right, or to take profit from their businesses and then investing together as one SSAS, but they've effectively collaborated, and that's, I guess, what we would call internal collaboration.
Right.
The same would be business partners pooling their pensions together and then, going out and investing together as one, almost like being in business together in their pensions.
Well, yeah, in many respects, a SSAS is a business pension, isn't it? It reflects your business. Yeah. Whereas a SIPP, interestingly, the way you've described it, Paul, it seems to reflect somebody else's business.
Well, that's a great example of how it works. Really, you're almost borrowing a vehicle with a SIPP that isn't yours for the duration of your retirement, whereas with a SSAS, you're creating your own vehicle.
Right. So how many people can you have together? I mean, husband and wife sounds easy. Siblings, families, whole families?
Sure. Yeah, you can really have, it's down to you as the trustee of your own SSAS to invite people in.
Right.
There is a maximum limit. You can have only, you can have up to 11 people, 11 trustees in the SSAS.
Well, that's a big family, isn't it?
It's a pretty big family, and actually it's a pretty big business, because most of the people that join the SSAS are the owners and the directors or the immediate family of those people, generally speaking.
Yeah, okay. So, well, that's interesting. So more money pooled together, I guess, means, therefore, you've got a bigger pot to make different investments, and the more money you've got, usually the more choice you've got, because you can use money and diversify easier as well. And the more money you've got if you're using leverage. Do you want to just touch on leverage, Paul?
Sure. Yeah.
What can you do in a SSAS for leverage, and what can you do in a SIPP for leverage?
So the rules are the same, whether it's SIPP or SSAS. All pensions have the ability to take leverage, and there is a maximum limit, which is 50% of the value of the pension.
Right.
So whether you've got one person in a SSAS or 10, the total amount of leverage is capped at 50% of the value of the pot. There's no pounds and pence restriction. Right. It is as simple as, if you have £1 million SSAS, you could find up to £500,000 worth of leverage.
Okay. So let's pause for a second then. Let me just think about that. So if I've got, I mean, most people don't have £1 million, right? So let's if we say most SSAS owners have around 300-400 grand. So let's use 400. Yeah. It's a nice round number. 400,000 quid, but I can get leverage to 600,000, borrowing 200. I've got more bang for my buck there, haven't I?
Yeah, absolutely.
That means the tax man is giving me a tax-free return that I can control an asset worth 600, but only have 400 of my own.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Okay, that's a bit whizzy.
It is. It's a huge boost to your wealth building plan in your pension, that's for sure.
Right.
In the same way as leverage.
Yeah, we all need a boost, given stock markets can take away. If you can get back by leverage and use that money, you're protecting yourself a little as well, aren't you, against downside risk? Because
that's right. Yeah.
Money you don't have and legitimately get it. Okay. What about joint ventures in the sense of external collaboration then?
So a SSAS, again, I said a little while ago, is a friendly vehicle. You know, it really is perfectly possible to JV your SSAS with any other SSAS, any other business, and actually even your own business if you wanted to.
Right.
So you can pool the SSAS resources and your money in a business or somebody else's SSAS or business and come together to collectively invest. And so again, there's that boost to the purchasing power and the returns that you can get, where you're pooling sums of money to give you a bigger capital pot.
Wow. So given we're in a kind of more of a community-led environment these days, certainly within the SSAS community, we know this to be true. There's thousands of us now in the SSAS community. So people can pool together because they are their own trustee, so they can almost join together. Whereas SIPPs working together, is that different?
It's possible. It's just a little bit more, you know, you're kind of bolting the vehicles together sometimes, and it tends to just be a little bit more clunky. Still doable, still possible, but isn't quite as simple.
Because you've got lots of different trustees who want to be the boss, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, especially where you have, you know, SSAS, which can have multiple members, but it's still only one vehicle. There might be a SSAS with 10 people in it, but that's still only one entity investing, you know, with the other entity, the business or whoever it may be. Whereas with a SIPP, if you had, you know, 10 people, that's 10 individual vehicles all trying to come together. It's just administratively more painful and more costly, if nothing else.
Yeah, I think from experience, Paul, I've seen the SIPP trustees can't agree, and therefore, I've seen that where it just can't happen. Okay, that's interesting. So, collaboration is easier, friendlier in your case, as you describe it. You've got leverage of money coming in terms of people pooling together, leverage of getting external borrowing, and leverage in pooling your SSASs together for bigger projects, or you can lend and collaborate with somebody else's project externally. Like if somebody's got you wanting to learn commercial to residential conversions, let's say, and keep property as the example, because a lot of collaboration property, you could put your money in your SSAS into somebody else's project and collaborate that way.
Sure, absolutely. Okay.
Wow, there's lots of things that can be done. Surely there can't be more, and we're only at number 5.
Wow. Brace yourself then. Now, not so much about functionality, but really, you touched on this earlier, Kevin, and that's just thinking about the costs of SIPP versus SSAS.
Right. Well, SIPPs are always cheaper. They've got to be, surely.
Well, you would think. You would think that, but actually, rarely is that the case in truth. And a part of the reason for that comes back to the point you were making earlier. You mentioned something called capital adequacy. If you're trying to do more sophisticated things in a SIPP, it can end up costing you much more for that SIPP trustee to try and, putting aside the complexity of whether they will or won't let you do it. Right. And if we just lined up a SIPP and a SSAS together and said, the SSAS is going to do this thing and the SIPP is going to do this thing, the SIPP has a whole raft of extra costs it has to pay due to the regulation it sits under, which ultimately get passed on to the SIPP owner.
Right.
Which makes them side by side comparatively more costly than the SSAS.
So hold on. So the extra cost for capital adequacy is just to ensure that the SIPP trustee is protected.
Yes, it largely comes down to making sure that if the professional trustee goes bust, there is enough money in the pot to allow for capital adequacy is really boring, so we won't get into the details, but there's enough money in the pot to allow the transition of another professional trustee effectively to come in and take over the management of all of the pensions.
So you're insuring against somebody else when in a SSAS you're the trustee anyway, and you're getting administrative support, really, which is not really likely to go bust because it's purely administration. It's almost like a service you can get from anyway.
Exactly. It's just like if your accountant went bust, it wouldn't have a detrimental impact to your business.
Yeah, it'd be a bit of pain. Yeah. Okay. All right. So there's some. Charges are 2 things, aren't they, Paul? Setup charges and running charges. Yeah, so talk to me about what's the difference in cost to set up a SIPP and to set up a SSAS in broad terms, because lots of different flavors and lots of different types, but in broad terms, the difference without being specific on numbers.
Sure. Well, I guess there are, if you're looking for a SIPP, which is just going to do the very bog standard basic things like funds, which in truth probably isn't really much of a SIPP. It's more like just a functional personal pension. They tend not to have really any setup costs, but of course they don't really have any functionality. If you're looking to set up a SIPP to do something like buy a commercial property, then that's a broadly similar cost to setting up a SSAS to do the same thing.
A few £100.
A few £100, yeah. And the main difference between the two is actually that the costs for setting up and running a SSAS are a tax-deductible expense for your business, whereas the costs for setting up and running a SIPP have to be taken from the SIPP pot.
Okay.
So on the one side, there's a fresh set of tax relief available on those costs to the business because it is sponsoring the scheme.
Right.
But in a SIPP, because it's a personal pension, the costs will have to be met by the pension. They can't be invoiced to the business and then claimed as a tax deductible expense because it's not a company pension.
That's interesting. Okay. And I mean, a SIPP is a kind of off-the-shelf thing.
Yeah.
So, in technical terms, we might call that some kind of a, it's a trust fund. All pensions are trust fund, hence the name trustee. But a SIPP would be a sort of off-the-shelf trust, somebody else's trust, a borrowed trust. I like that. You're borrowing somebody else's trust. But to create your own trust, which is your own unique SSAS, unique to you and you alone, not somebody else's, there's a set of costs for that, though, isn't there?
There is, and it varies across, different SSAS administrators, of course.
In
broad terms, it ranges between £500 and £1,000.
Okay. So, all right. So a one-off cost in that range, but it gives you the functionality for the rest of your life because it's one-off?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, it gives you the ability and the power to pass on that legacy asset as well because you own it.
Okay. Well, I guess that's a legacy point to come on to. What about running costs then? Because like if we take the biggest SIPP provider in the UK, we mustn't name people, Paul, because it's broadcastable, but a big one in Bristol will be charging 0.45%, so a percentage of the fund. So if you take an average SSAS, then it's say we use 400, that'd be 1,600 quid a year for a funds only platform. What would be a comparable cost in a SSAS?
Well, you could set up a SSAS and do all sorts of different functional things for less than that.
How much less?
And you're probably talking between, realistically, in most cases, 1,000 to 1,500 a year.
But not if it's just funds. So we're just comparing.
But not if it's just funds. No, if it's just funds, you're talking, £500-600.
So okay, so £500 or £600 against £1,600. Yes, you've got to buy the funds, but you can probably buy funds if you're buying them wholesale, maybe at 0.4 for the funds. Whereas if you're buying a platform like a big SIPP, you're paying 0.45 for the platform plus the cost of funds. So probably 1.8. I'm not trying to confuse people with charges, but if you kind of add that up in your head, and I'm just using 400 because that's easy, you can scale it down to whatever figure. But 400,000 if you're paying maybe 1.5 total, 6,000 in fees for a funds-only SIPP. Whereas in a SSAS, a funds-only SSAS, you'd be paying, what's that, sort of £1,500 to £2,000. So, a third of the price.
Yeah.
So,
and of course, with the SIPP, the charges are tend to be open-ended. What I mean by that is, it doesn't matter if you've got £1 million or £100,000, the percentage generally stays the same.
Right. So if I earn more money, so I take my SIPP to $1 million, long term, assume we never have a stock market crash. I've got $1 million. I'm paying 45 grand. Yeah. As opposed to, still 50.
To a few £1,000 or less in a SSAS, 1,500 or 1,000 or even less if it's funds only.
Right. So the fixed cost element of SSAS, because it's related to just administration, fundamentally, if you're planning to have a decent sized pension, would be a metric that you need to pay attention to.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you only intend to have a little tiny pension, an easy online SIPP would be a lot cheaper. But if you intend to have a much bigger pension, a SSAS in the long term would be cheaper, right?
Yeah. Sorry.
Very interesting that on charges. And we've got a calculator, haven't we, that we share with people and show people exactly what, based on what they think, the difference would be. And almost every time we show people the calculator, blows their socks off, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. It's when you see the difference in pounds and pence, it's really, a huge eye-opener for people.
Yeah, okay. Okay, more stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. Number 7, advisors and professionals.
Oh, advisors and... Well, look, joking apart, you need advisors where advice is adding value. And of course, in order to run a SSAS or a SIPP, you need professionals. So there's always going to be a need. So what are the key differences here then?
Well, without sounding like a broken record, the key difference here is really choice. When you have a SSAS, you can choose exactly who you want your professional advisor or your other professional to be. You can call on the support of a professional you've used before, perhaps a tax expert, a solicitor, a conveyancer, an IFA. You can choose anyone you want.
Right, you're in control of the choice of the people.
Exactly. So you can pick and choose whatever professional services you need, and you're not limited there to any number of people you can choose from.
Okay.
In the SIPP world, what you tend to find is there will be a panel of professionals. Typically, things like solicitors is a good example. If you're wanting to buy a piece of commercial property, you're usually locked into using a panel solicitor that has been pre-selected and pre-approved by the SIPP trustee.
Right. Okay. And
so there's nowhere near as much choice.
Okay. So, and I guess then if someone is managing their SSAS with investments that they've chosen, or they're managing property, they don't need to have an IFA if they don't want one?
No, they don't. No, I'm not obliged to take financial advice. So, of course, we're big advocates of advice, as you mentioned, when it's adding value, when you're not clear on the pros and cons. If you feel you need that guidance of a professional, you should absolutely seek it. But if you're confident that what you're doing and the decision you're making is the right decision, then you're not obliged to take financial advice. You can create a SSAS without that.
Okay. All right. What's next?
The next up, access and benefits, which we skirted around earlier when we were talking about SSAS loan back.
Okay, so
I think attention now.
Yeah, okay. So I think what you said with the loan back is within a SSAS, you've got the option, subject to rules that we know, you can access some of that money by lending half back to the company. And you don't have to wait till you're 55, when normally pensions are made accessible.
Yeah.
Right. So if a business was struck by COVID and they had a decent pension pot, would they be able to borrow money from that pension pot to help support the business, subject to the following the pension law rules?
Yeah, absolutely they would. As long as they're a business that is a healthy business and is suffering a problem because of a, in this case, pandemic, the ability to get cash flow from the pension is there with the SSAS.
Okay. And for people who want to buy property, they can do a loan back and help their property business if they're a property business as well?
Yeah, absolutely. There are no limitations or restrictions on what a SSAS loan can be used for, as long as it is legitimately in connection with the activity and the trade of the business.
Okay.
So as long as there's a match-up, it's absolutely fine.
And can you do that in a SIPP?
You cannot do that in a SIPP. There is absolutely no circumstance where your business can have a loan from a SIPP under any circumstances. It would be a breach of the rules and incur you an enormous tax penalty.
Well, the trustees wouldn't let you have it anyway.
They wouldn't. No, they wouldn't. So no, it's not possible in the SIPP under any circumstances to borrow money back into your company.
Okay, so I'm saying that for any business owner, having corporation tax relief on their contribution, so their money, so they've got money in, but they haven't paid the tax on it, so the money's worth more, and they can get access to 50%, following some rules the HMRC set down. But they can, in general terms, can access that money, but they can do that in a SSAS but not a SIPP. Then the business owner's got a lot to consider there when it comes to that access at whatever age, whether you're 30, 40, 50, 60 or 70, whatever. Okay, what about benefits then? Benefits in terms of tax-free cash, drawing income, are they different, the rules, or the same? What's the situation there?
a SIPP and a SSAS follow the same rulebook when it comes to taking benefits. I guess, again, there's a choice. With a SSAS, again, you're in the driving seat. You can choose absolutely any retirement option you want. You can draw income flexibly. And again, that applies to SIPP and SSAS. If you've got a modern day SIPP, you can draw income flexibly from it. Okay. Both allow the same amount of tax-free cash.
Okay, then. So the rules on getting access to the money at 55 and older are the same.
They are.
But the fundamental difference is access early.
With a SSAS, yes. Through the yes.
Okay. Which is quite critical if you're, in your 30s, 40s, or early 50s, and you want to help the business. You just simply couldn't open the box of the traditional pension before that, but this allows you to do that, which can help your business grow and your pension grow, because if you're creating a loan, the loan helps the business, but the interest helps the SSAS.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. That's pretty good. All right. Is there any more?
There are two more. So number 9, we touched on it very briefly earlier, is legacy.
Okay. Tell me how that's different then.
Well, I mean, I suppose the big difference comes back to the ownership of the vehicle that I mentioned a few minutes ago. When you create a SSAS, you're creating your own vehicle. And because you're creating your own vehicle, you have the choice about how it gets passed on. In a SIPP,
okay,
generally speaking, you're borrowing the vehicle. And normally speaking, a SIPP is only really interested in finding a beneficiary and sending the money to them.
Wow.
Rather than the long-term protection of that money in the tax shelter.
Right, let me see if I can restate it differently, Paul. In a SIPP, it's a trust, but it's somebody else's trust. If you die, they look to the beneficiaries of the trust and they want to pay the money out.
Yeah, generally speaking.
Yeah. We'll keep it general. In a SSAS, generally speaking, you've created your own family trust fund. So you can invite your kids over 18
that's right,
as trustees.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, when you die, the trust carries on.
That's right. It's like a perpetual legacy vehicle.
A multi-member, intergenerational, tax-free legacy that goes on and on and on and on as long as you pass on the wisdom. And some of the beneficiaries don't say, well, we're having the money and off we go.
You got it.
What about, wow. Okay, so if anybody's got kids and they don't want the kids just to spend the money and sail off into the sunset, if you want to give them some wisdom, then get them to understand you're creating a family trust fund. What about lifetime allowance? That's £1 million, give or take, in round numbers before tax gets a bit more complex. What about strategies with SIPP or SSAS for lifetime allowance? So SIPP, one-person vehicle, lifetime allowance, £1 million. So what if I've married, got 3 kids. So what's my lifetime allowance if I invite them all into my SSAS?
Everyone still has the same £1 million, give or take. But one of the really quite powerful, amazingly clever things that a SSAS can do is it can allow you to have a strategy where over time you start shifting some of the growth, the biggest growth that you have in your SSAS, to the people with the smaller pots. And the people with the biggest pots take the smaller growth. So over time, it has the impact of gradually balancing out and evening out the flow of the money and the flow of the returns, so that you actually make use of those other people's allowances.
Right. So while it all sounds complicated, and I'm sure it is, the issue in an exercise like this, which is just saying the differences, you've got control over how you build the pot within different members of your family, which impacts both the quality and the quantity of the legacy that you leave.
Absolutely. Nicely said.
Well, Paul, if this was a boxing match, I'm kind of thinking who I think would win.
It would be on the ropes now, I think.
Well, yeah, but there are some situations when, only a SIPP will work.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really probably if people aren't eligible for SSAS. So talk to me a bit more about that.
Sure. Okay. So generally speaking, anyone can have a SIPP. In fact, you can even create.
Go on, anybody can have a SIPP. So
anyone can have a SIPP.
Because you can buy it off the shelf, you can just buy it whether you're a kid or whether you're a grown-up.
That's right, yeah. So you can take out a SIPP for your child, start building some pension for them.
Right.
Because you're not in the driving seat, you don't have to be of a minimum age. With a SSAS, it's different. And that's because a SSAS is a different type of pension. It's a company pension, an occupational pension. And a SSAS needs to be granted the right to exist by HMRC. So whereas you pull a SIPP off the shelf, fill in your name and you have a SIPP, with a SSAS you have to apply to HMRC and you have to be granted the permission to have a SSAS.
Right. So which means you need to be, in inverted commas, fit and proper, and ready, willing and able to take on that responsibility.
Sure.
So that's not going to be for everybody, Paul. There are some people who just want to get involved. They'd rather stick their money in a fund and say, do not disturb till I'm 65 and crack on with that.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right, absolutely. I guess.
So you can be different. A different person will like one or the other for that reason.
Sure. Yeah, that's right. That's right, absolutely. I guess, generally speaking, a SSAS is a more entrepreneurial vehicle. It's a more business-minded vehicle. But actually also one of the key eligibility criteria for having a SSAS, because it's a type of company pension, is you must actually have a live, active business.
Right. So that's a key difference then. So you need to be a business owner with a business that's doing something.
That's
you
right.
apply to HMRC. Any complexity with that application?
Well, you've got to make sure that you show HMRC some key things, really chiefly that your business is doing things and that the people involved in the SSAS are also on the UK tax radar and connected to the company.
Right, okay. So not too complicated. If you've got
not mega complicated, but it still needs the right guidance and help to get it done properly, because otherwise you can end up either moving too quickly, moving when you're not quite ready, and that can end up in you getting a rejection from HMRC.
Right, okay. But, the evidence that we've worked with is pretty much 100%. If we believe somebody's going to get an approval, they get an approval, right?
Yeah, we've got a 100% success rate, let's call it, if you like.
And a guarantee that if they don't get approval, there's no cost involved anyway.
Absolutely, yeah, that's right.
Okay. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground, Paul.
We have.
So, in summarising then, we've covered wider investment choice, the ability to invest in different ways in property. You can buy stocks in different ways and you can have much more choice and buy them more cheaply, potentially, in a SSAS. You've got leverage opportunities. You've got the ability to collaborate. You've got so many points of access. So in general terms, if someone is of a disposition that says, look, I want to be in control of my own life, my own wealth, because ultimately this is a wealth tool. The SSAS is a wealth tool, as a SIPP should be too, by the way. There are some times when someone should start off with a SIPP, like going through driving school. We talked about pensions of vehicles. They could learn their ropes in a SIPP even.
Yeah, absolutely.
A kid can't have a SSAS, right? So so that's another option, isn't it? So start off with a SIPP, learn some of the skills, and then graduate basically to SaaS when you're ready to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
All right.
Be a good strategy. Yeah.
Okay. So in broad terms, I hope for those who've listened in, it's a good run through the benefits and the differences between the two. Obviously, we're quite biased towards SaaS for the type of client we deal with, who are entrepreneurs anyway. But there are some people where SIPP is a good thing too for the simplicity of stocks and commercial property. But as always, it's look at the costs. Paul, we've got another video we can share at some point soon, which is if you're looking to engage with someone to help you with SaaS, then we've got the 7 key questions you should always ask before engaging with anyone. And that would be something we can get on and do another call at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do it. I look forward to it.
Okay. Well, look, Paul, thanks for your time this evening. Thanks for sharing. Thanks to you for watching and listening. We hope you found it useful, and we'll see you again soon on another lesson from us here at WealthBuilders.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget that we are constantly updating our resources inside the WealthBuilders membership site to help you create, build, and protect your wealth. Head over to wealthbuilders.co.uk/membership right now for free access. That's wealthbuilders.co.uk/membership.